The ground along the western shore of the Dead Sea is collapsing. Right now, over 6,000 sinkholes have opened since the 1980s, and new ones appear every year without warning. Fences, warning signs, abandoned resorts, and a few kilometers away, inside the caves of Qumran, scholars found 11 manuscripts of the Book of Enoch. But one chapter never showed up, the chapter about Leviathan. It says the beast is sealed beneath the sea, above the fountains of the waters, until judgment. Officials call it myth, but the ground keeps doing exactly what the text describes. Stand at Ein Gedi, and you will see a road that no longer goes anywhere. It stops at a fence. Behind that fence, the earth has been eaten from below. Not eroded from the surface, eaten. Hollowed out from underneath and then dropped, all at once, without a sound to warn anyone standing on top of it. In 1998, a sinkhole opened at a campsite here and swallowed a member of the staff. In 2020, the spa at Ein Gedi was evacuated permanently. The count of these holes has passed 6,000. Some say 7. Nobody agrees on the exact number, because new ones keep appearing while the old ones are still being counted. That should already unsettle you, but it gets worse. Because a few kilometers from this exact fence line sits Qumran, the cave system where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found. And among those scrolls were 11 separate copies of a book most Bibles do not include, the Book of Enoch. Not a footnote, not a curiosity. 11 manuscripts written in Aramaic, copied and recopied by a community that treated this text as close to Scripture as anything else in those caves. This is not a fringe document. This is one of the most heavily copied texts found at Qumran, outranked only by a handful of biblical books like Psalms and Isaiah. So ask the obvious question. If this community valued Enoch that much, why is one part of it missing? Chapter 60 is missing. Every other section of Enoch turned up in that cave, in Aramaic, dated by scholars to centuries before Christ. But the section that talks about Leviathan and Behemoth, the section that tells you where these two creatures were sent, never appears. Not one fragment. Scholars like J.T. Millick flagged this silence directly. He argued the missing section might be centuries later than the rest of the book, possibly written outside the very community that preserved everything else. Other scholars disagree and place it earlier, closer to the time of Christ. But nobody disputes the fact itself. The one chapter that describes where Leviathan is bound is the one chapter absent from the crime scene. One researcher who has spent decades on these scrolls put it plainly. If a pre-Christian copy of that missing section were ever found, it would be treated as a sensation in the field. Read that again. A sensation. Not a curiosity, a sensation. Because right now, the earliest surviving copy of the passage that tells you where Leviathan is sealed is separated from the events it claims to describe by centuries of silence. So let's read what that missing chapter actually says, not paraphrased through a sermon, read as testimony. On a certain day, two great monsters are separated from one another. A female monster named Leviathan is sent to dwell in the depths of the ocean, above the fountains of the waters. A male monster named Behemoth is sent to occupy a waste wilderness named Duodyne, east of the garden where the righteous dwell. The text does not say Leviathan symbolizes chaos. It does not say the sea represents disorder. It says she is cast on a specific day into a specific location, positioned above a specific hydrological feature. Above the fountains of the waters. Not near it, not within it, above it. That is not how metaphor usually behaves. Notice the verbs, parted, cast, occupied, dwell. These are not the verbs of a vision drifting through symbolic imagery. These are the verbs of a report. Someone is describing an assignment, a placement, a location relative to a named feature. And it does not stop with Leviathan. In the same breath, Behemoth is given his own coordinates: a named wilderness, a direction, east of the garden. If this passage were purely mythic, purely about the totality of land and sea under God's control, it would not need named locations for both halves of the pairing. It would just say, the sea and the land. Instead, it names a place for the desert monster and gives spatial detail for the sea monster. The writer is thinking in geography, not poetry. The mainstream explanation is that this is ancient cosmology, the deep, Tehom, chaos waters beneath creation, a concept as old as Genesis itself. Fine, that works as far as it goes. But here is the problem. This specific region, this exact stretch of shoreline sitting beside the cave where this book survived, is the one place on Earth where that exact description is currently happening in front of geologists with instruments. Freshwater is moving underground here. It has been documented for decades. As the Dead Sea recedes, roughly a meter a year, the salt layers left behind by the retreating shoreline are exposed to fresh groundwater pushing down from the surrounding hills. That water dissolves the salt. It hollows cavities beneath the surface, cavities nobody can see, growing in silence, until the ground above them can no longer hold its own weight. Then it drops. Suddenly, without pattern, without a warning sign that the fence didn't already tell you about, above the fountains of the waters. Say that phrase again, now that you know what's underneath this exact stretch of shoreline. It is not floating in myth space anymore. It is describing a mechanism. Now, this does not mean the ancient writer understood subsurface hydrology. It does not mean he watched a sinkhole open. But it does mean the language he chose lines up, with unsettling precision, with a physical process unique to this basin. One detail like that could be coincidence. Let's keep going and see how many more line up before that word stops working. Because the geology itself is not even settled. For years, researchers assumed a solid layer of buried salt, 10 meters thick in places, was the cause of these collapses. Then in a 2023 study using seismic waves, researchers imaging one collapse zone found no salt layer where the models predicted one should be. The wave speeds were too slow. Something else was down there. Sediment layering, not a clean salt band. Which means the scientific community studying this exact stretch of ground still does not agree on what is structurally underneath it. The abyss, in the most literal geological sense, remains unmapped. Sit with that. The manuscript describing this creature's prison is missing from the archive, and the ground the text seems to describe is still, to this day, not fully understood by the people measuring it with modern instruments. There's more. Further along this same basin, other researchers have proposed something that reaches even further back. In 2001, geologist Eli Ross and archaeologist Amos Frumkin published a hypothesis connecting sinkhole-like ground collapse in this exact region to Genesis chapter 14, the account of Sodom and Gomorrah. The valley of Siddim, the text says, was full of slime pits, and the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah fell into them as they fled. Ross and Frumkin propose that ancient ground collapse, similar to what's happening today, may lie behind that image. This is not consensus. It is one team's argument contested by others. Flag it as a claim, not a fact. But notice what that claim does. It means this exact stretch of terrain has, on at least two separate occasions, in two separate ancient texts written centuries apart, produced language about the ground opening, swallowing, and sealing something beneath it. Genesis gives you pits that consume fleeing kings. Enoch gives you an abyss that holds a sealed monster above underground water. Different books, different centuries, same basin. That is not proof of anything supernatural, but it is a pattern, and patterns are exactly what should make you uncomfortable, not what should make you dismiss the coincidence. Now, the honest disclaimer, because you need to hear it once and hear it clearly. None of this proves a literal creature is bound beneath the Dead Sea. Nobody is claiming there is a physical Leviathan waiting in a cavity beneath En-Gedi. What this proves is narrower, and in some ways more disturbing. A manuscript that vanished from the historical record. a phrase that describes a mechanism this region is famous for. A geological structure that remains, to this day, disputed by the people studying it. That is not proof. That is an unresolved case file sitting in plain sight next to a sea that keeps changing its own shoreline every year. Read the passage again now that you know all of this. A female monster, sealed above the fountains of the waters, until judgment. Not until discovery, not until excavation, until judgment. The text does not give an expiration date. It does not promise the seal will ever be checked. It only tells you where, and it tells you the placement was deliberate, cast there, on purpose, by something with the authority to do it. Look at where you started. The fence at Engedi is still standing. The road behind it still stops at a hole in the ground that nobody can predict. Somewhere north of here, in a display case, sits a fragment of Enoch, one of the 11 copies pulled from those caves, still missing the one chapter that would tell scholars whether an earlier, pre-Christian version of this passage ever existed. It has never been found. It may never be found. And every year, several hundred new sinkholes open along this shoreline, expanding a field that was barely 100 holes wide in 1990, and now numbers in the thousands. Geology will keep explaining each new collapse as it happens. Freshwater, salt dissolution, retreating shoreline. All true, all documented. None of it explains why an excluded, undated fragment of an apocryphal book chose this exact language for this exact kind of ground thousands of years before anyone had instruments to measure what was happening beneath it. The text has not changed. It still says what it said when it was first copied down. What has changed is how willing anyone is to stand at that fence, read the passage out loud, and ask why the ground keeps agreeing with it. The sinkholes are still opening. The missing chapter is still missing. And whatever the text meant when it said sealed until judgment, no one standing on that shoreline today can tell you the seal has ever been checked.